Please welcome Alice McCown, publisher of The Atlantic.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alice McCown. I am the publisher of The Atlantic, and I am thrilled that you are here today for this really important conversation on innovation with integrity, the future of AI in healthcare. Boston is the center of a major shift where AI is advancing faster than the trust systems needed to support it. Digital health has huge potential to improve outcomes, but the real challenge isn't just technology, it's building transparency so those benefits reach every patient. Today, we'll hear from experts on the next wave of healthcare and how to bridge the gap between data and truly patient-centered results. So, everyone has cell phones. Please silence them, but keep them handy. If you see something or hear something that captures your attention, we encourage you to share it on your social networks. And before we begin, I really want to thank our underwriter, Eli Lilly and Company, for their support and making this morning's event possible. Here to share a few words is Amy Davis, Vice President of Clinical Trial Foundations at Eli Lilly.
Good morning. I'm glad you're here. The Atlantic has built its reputation on taking serious issues seriously. That's exactly the kind of conversation clinical research needs right now. So thank you for being the right partner for this. I'm Amy Davis, and I serve as the Vice President of Clinical Trial Foundations at Eli Lilly and Company. And I've spent over 25 years working across therapeutic areas in all phases of clinical and integrated drug development. A lot has changed during that time, but one thing that has not changed is Lilly's belief that every aspect of our work must be centered on patients. This conviction is what drives the work of Lilly's clinical design, delivery, and analytics team. We always begin with the fundamental set of questions. Who gets to participate in clinical research? And who is, knowingly or not, left out? For too long, clinical trial participation has been shaped by geography, infrastructure, and convenience, rather than access and patient need. And that's not just a scientific challenge, that's a human one. Community-based research is central to how we're tackling the challenge of bringing clinical trials directly into communities. It treats clinical trials not as a last resort, but as a genuine healthcare option that can be introduced early in a patient's journey. AI and digital innovation are accelerating this shift in ways that weren't even possible 5 years ago. These tools allow us to identify and engage patient populations more thoughtfully, reducing burden, and accelerating research without sacrificing scientific rigor. Just as importantly, these tools help us to build trials that actually reflect the patients who will ultimately use these medications. Representation and accessibility are not a box to check. They are the science. As science moves faster, our approaches to clinical research must keep pace. But speed without access isn't progress. We must ensure the right policies are in place to turn scientific advancements into real impact for patients. Today's discussion will explore how emerging technologies are transforming patient access to clinical trials and how innovation and patient-centeredness can and must advance together. We're grateful you're here, and we look forward to what's ahead.
For a conversation on leading the tech-driven patient transformation, please welcome Marc Succi, Executive Director of the Mesh Incubator at Mass General Brigham, and Rebecca Weintraub, Associate Professor at Harvard Medical School and Associate Physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, with Atlantic Live contributor Thomas Getz.
How many of you know what the BUR and WBUR stands for? Okay, I'm glad to tell you this. It stands for Boston University Radio. I had that epiphany walking through today. So just thought I'd share that with you for your trivia. Well, this is going to be a great day, a great morning. We're going to start, as we should, talking about patients and talking about clinical care, where the rubber meets the road. And we have two fantastic individuals here in Marc and Rebecca. They are both clinical innovators as well as intrinsically patient-centered. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I guess I would start by asking you both, well, there's this moment in the pit where, if you've seen it, the last episode, where the innovator comes into the ER and she's got AI. She's got a new AI tool, and most of the staff rolls their eyes, and right away it's hallucinating. And I'm curious if what you think of that. Is that an accurate description of where we are in this moment in terms of AI adoption in clinical care? Or is something more subtle than what we see on TV going on? Marc, I'll start with you.
I can go first. So I stopped watching medical shows with Grey's Anatomy, and I haven't seen The Pit. I would say the hallucinations are an accurate representation. I would say maybe what's not accurate is AI getting to the point of interacting on the floor with patients in the ED without having appropriate infrastructure, monitoring, or approvals, or human in the loops. So I think the technology is limited in certain ways. It's very good. It's increasing fast. But in terms of implementing it, it's not quite there yet. And hallucinations in this TV show wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Rebecca, what do you see? What are you seeing day to day?
Well, I have two kids who are just absolutely addicted to The Pit. And this is incredible product placement. So I think about with E.T. is Reese's Pieces. With The Pit, it's also the use of the butterfly ultrasound. Right. And when we think about how do we adopt a new piece of hardware, what does it mean when we have a handheld ultrasound, the training that we need to do, the pre-qualifications to use it well, to do a blind sweep, we need the similar type of training for AI. So we have an enthusiast being the attending, and then we have kind of some skeptical trainees who are using it for efficiency, but to Marc's point, not for the quality or improving the interaction between the patient and the provider.
Okay, so where are we seeing it in terms of what is the low-hanging fruit? I know everyone's talking about scribing. Let's not talk about scribing, which is when you go into the doctor's office and they kind of don't have to chart everything because there's an AI. Beyond that, what might be the kind of fruitful areas for AI adoption in clinical care?
The way I think about it is for the short to medium term, what is high feasibility but relatively low risk, and that's, for me, the sweet spot right now. Ambient scribes, obviously, but also simple things like not making I'm a radiologist, so not reading CT scans and making a diagnosis, but doing things like in the emergency room, previewing all the head CTs. Let's say there's 20 on a list. The AI will preview them and then reorder them based on what's likely to be positive, what the likely head bleeds are, strokes, and I'll read those first. And so stuff like that, where it's kind of pseudo-diagnostic but not diagnostic, I think is relatively low risk, relatively not too much regulation around it, and a big impact in terms of length of stay, but also time to clinical care.
Okay. Rebecca?
Well, I first just take a step back that I think for most of the world, most folks do not have a primary care physician. They aren't being seen by a provider, and so there's even 5,000 hours between one point in the year where they see a provider and another. So all of that uncertainty and the roller coaster that our patients are facing, we see that people are going to use AI in the midst of that time period. So as providers, I think we actually have to be prepared because we are already having most patients consume the output that they've received on an LLM. And that actually takes a bit of skepticism, acknowledging it's not misinformation, it's the patient put in incomplete information about their symptoms, and then they got some hard answer with a ton of confidence at 2 a.m. And then I'm seeing that patient on a Saturday morning with 30 other patients that I need to round on at 7 a.m. Similar to I use it to reorder which patients I see first, but also to realize that my patient already has had a hard answer from the output of an LLM.
Okay, so that I really appreciate the fact that the people they used to be the warning against patients using Dr. Google, but now it's Dr. ChatGPT, I guess, and it does seem much more real and compelling to the patient, and as you touch on that introduces risks, and I'm curious, Marc, you mentioned low risk, high reward, but is there such a thing as low risk when we're talking about kind of bringing in these very sophisticated technologies and who knows what the patient is learning or experiencing beforehand? Like what does happen to the kind of risk equation in clinical care?
So if you're talking about patients using AI and chatbots, certainly not zero risk. I would say it's low risk. The main difference for me versus Dr. Google or whatever website is that it's somewhat context specific. They can give their own symptoms and get an answer that seems specific to them. The risk really is in interpreting the outputs. So unless you're trained like a physician, you don't really know how to critically appraise necessarily the outputs of these models, and they're generally not explaining themselves. And so I think in terms of the risk, it's really in the interpretation of the results for the patient, the anxiety that it can create if it tells you things that might not be right, might be wrong, and also taking, let's say, nutrition advice or other types of advice from a chatbot without actually having a trained physician appraise the output. And I think that's where the risk lies. So as long as at some point it's being brought to a trained professional, I think the risk could be minimal. But if it's not, I think there's some level of low to medium risk for the patients.
Okay. I have to mention privacy, because privacy is an issue with, these are, oftentimes these AIs are black boxes. We're not really sure what data is flowing in, what we get out. How do you think about patient privacy and really kind of patient assurance in that kind of clinical encounter if there is AI involved? What concerns do arise from the patients, and how do you address those? Or how does one address those? Rebecca?
Yes, I mean, I think I practice both here and globally, and so I'd say most patients do not have a provider at their side. So they're leaning on a family member, they're coming with a family member to get advice, and they tend to say, I need this, I need to find an answer, I'm willing to sacrifice securing my own personal information. So they've made that individual choice, and then a provider is making an individual choice of which tools will I use when I'm facing clinical uncertainty. I use a portfolio of tools. I don't rely on just one tool. Certain tools help me with drug-drug interactions, certain help me with rashes, for examples, but I also need to train that patient that's in front of me. This is one output. You need to be, in a sense, an astute consumer like you would of any information source. And I think we've learned from previous encounters with our patients, if it's an episode of ER, an episode of The Pit, these are fictionalized portrayals of disease and symptoms. We need to use the same type of skepticism and astute quality as you are consuming an output based on a reasoning model.
Yeah. Okay, so we have patients coming in using AI. There's a lot of competition to get to you guys, into clinicians, to get inside clinical practice. There's open evidence, there's UpToDate. I mean, these are all tools that are guiding decision support. But then there's ChatGPT for clinicians, ChatGPT for healthcare. I don't know what the difference is between those two. How do you decide where to start? And especially as leaders of institutions, how do you decide where to put your chips down and what tools are most appropriate? And how much of your time right now is just spent testing?
Luckily for us, Mass General Brigham is somewhat on the forefront of governance and having local models run behind a firewall to the privacy security concerns. So I'm much more likely to use a model that adheres to our institutional governance policies.
Okay, so there's other people involved, not just you.
Not just me, and that makes a big difference to me, but also to getting buy-in from the patients when you can assure them, and obviously you need to ask them for consent to use these tools. A word on these different companies. A lot of companies like Open Evidence and UpToDate and Doximity build features. They don't build AI companies. The only AI companies are OpenAI, Anthropic, Google. And I think we're going to see, and what ChatGPT has done and what OpenAI has done is waited to see the market respond to these purpose-built features like Open Evidence. They own the model. It's very easy for them to flip a switch, which is exactly what they did. And I think it's clearly going to become the dominant model for health.
Okay. Rebecca, how are you sorting through all these different tools? I know you're actually quite articulate, or quite that you use them a lot. You're out there using them. So let me know what your perspective is on how you sort them out.
So I have a network of 300,000 clinicians in 192 countries. Very few of them have the same governance infrastructure that Marc's speaking to. So these are early adopters in their country. They need to develop the governance. They need to have the physiologic feedback loops, the contextual feedback loops. But in the meantime, they are testing like I am at midnight to be vibe coded. And so you can pull up for every patient, what does up-to-date open evidence, ChatGPT for clinicians, Vera Health, and others, and what's the difference? And Paul English, who's been an incredible mentor to me, he built this when he launched Kayak. I don't know if you remember the first days of Kayak, but you could pull up Priceline, Expedia, and Kayak. And the idea was for you to see the difference in the search. Kayak was faster, it got you fewer clicks, it got you to the airplane seat. This is an efficiency play, and when we're looking at we have not gotten to the methods to improve. Did this improve your clinical decision support? And Marc, I'm hoping you're going to talk about your new paper, because I think that does speak to which of the models do better in this early stage of uncertainty in a diagnosis. And we need additional methods, and we honestly need more research in this area that's underfunded. Many of the outputs of these companies that you just mentioned, those are white papers from the company.
Yeah.
It looks like a paper when you look at how but it's, remember, once again, it's kind of their own blog basically saying
not
that
peer
they
reviewed.
tested their model. Correct.
Yeah. Well, Marc, do tell us, everybody's waiting, what was your new paper?
Yeah, we did publish a paper recently.
Not a white paper.
No, not a white paper. So I run an AI lab, and we actually published the first paper in February 2023 on GPT and clinical decision support. So we took the Merck manual, which has 36 bread and butter cases, like, coming with appendicitis, ectopic pregnancy, stuff everyone needs to know. We ran the models through at the time. I would say it was at the level of an intern, good intern. But what really was poor about these models was the differential diagnosis. So the ability of AI to make a plausible list of diagnoses, let's say 7, comprehensive but concise, based on limited information, a one-liner, 45-year-old patient with abdominal pain, that's it. And so it was pretty poor then. And so we repeated the paper, except just using ChatGPT, we used 29 different frontier models, including GPT-5. It's the most comprehensive to date. It turns out it's 90% accurate, these models, when they have, on these same cases, when they have an open book test. Every lab, every piece of information, every physical exam, great. Medicine isn't like that. And so medicine, you come in with a one-liner, the model still failed at 80% of the differential diagnosis. And for me, people would comment and say, well, what's the problem if it gets the final diagnosis eventually? Well, the problem is you can't test for unlimited diagnoses. You can't waste 2 hours in a patient with a stroke. You have to have the right test and the right model at the right time. And so for us, the differential is the art of medicine. The models struggle with limited information. They're very good with a lot of information, just to your point earlier. And so our paper essentially still says these models are barely improving at the most important step of medicine, that is the start of the visit.
And so that raises a good point. Sometimes in the white papers, you see these claims of accuracy, and they're 95, 93, 97%, which sounds fantastic until you actually think about what that 3% means in patient care. And so, Rebecca, can you fill in the gap there?
Yeah. Well, also, the benchmarking is based on an exam that we take as clinicians.
Right.
Not the Merck manual clinical cases, for example. So think about the diversity of how patients present with the same disease. That's one part of this. The second thing that I think about is that the companies are trying to ensure that the models are better at reasoning for the general purpose of a large language model. Not for the general purpose for a radiologist or for myself as a hospitalist or for a clinician in Rwanda that at 2 a.m. has no subspecialty around them. And so the question is kind of, do the secondary products in the market, open evidence, for example, Vera, UpToDate, are they able to provide that globally for the population and the clinicians that we would like them to have service for? And that's also questionable. So yesterday, I think many of you saw, open evidence pulled itself down in the EU and the UK. And it's unclear when the pull down was that they're saying this is because of the EU AI Act. That's probably not why that got pulled down. They probably are being regulated as a medical device. They're not being regulated as a medical device in the US. And so they chose to pull themselves down because you can imagine kind of some of the yellow flags that must have popped up. So we have now floods of European clinicians saying to us, can you help us find access? We already started using this tool. It's part of the vibe coding that I just spoke about. What is the substitute? What else can I be using? Because I no longer can access open evidence. And that's also a secondary problem here. We get people habituated to these products. They get It's integrated within not necessarily their workflow, i.e. their EMR, but their clinical reasoning. And now we need to make sure they're available longitudinally. And that's going to require a commitment beyond one product company, one LLM. It's going to require large-scale commitment that this is an essential product for the workforce.
Right. Right. Actually, it's funny we haven't mentioned Epic so far because they have AI too. Kind of classically not built for the physician, built for other audiences or constituencies in the world of healthcare. But Marc, you've compared AI adoption to EHR adoption, and as I recall, what you said was EHR adoption was a much bigger change in terms of the clinical lift than what happened, I should say, with EHRs. Like that was more kind of disruptive, I suppose. Is that true? Do you guys?
Yeah, I would agree because I said
you
it.
said it, yeah. Again.
But I do think
you still agree.
So I'm not that old, but I was at the Brigham doing my rotation when they still had patient charts. So like right at the turnover, I was in my third year of medical school, and it was extremely disruptive to change to Epic. There's a lot of growing pains. We're obviously a lot better for it. It'd be crazy to use patient charts at this point. But it was a totally different workflow.
Yeah.
And the best AI tools nowadays, they fit into the workflow. Like you said, Epic's homegrown tools are probably going to outpace the ones where you have to use a separate window, browser, et cetera. So I think at least, physicians are adept at using information and ingesting information and producing their own outputs, which is primarily what AI is being used for. I think EHRs were a totally different beast at the time. That's my opinion.
Rebecca, do you have an opinion on Epic? I've never known a doctor who hasn't had an opinion on Epic.
Well, I remember my Saturday training when I had to be the pre-training for Epic. So you sat in a hotel not far from here for 10 hours. My Epic trainee was exhausted from his night before, whatever he was doing, very inarticulate. And I was sitting there with the head of medicine, Atul Gawande. I mean, the room was filled with this incredible clinical expertise, and we were all painfully trying to understand how to open up an Epic window. And what I think about, what a waste of opportunity that this was. We were kind of given an old Oldsmobile, even at that time with $1 billion investment. And I think I shared with you, what Epic did was create this stronghold. We had to finish the pre-training before you could ever be back on service. And if you were late, each hospital got charged $1 million a day if there was one clinician left that didn't finish this pre-training. We've done the exact...
By Epic. Epic charged you $1 million a day.
Exactly. So we've done the inverse here, right? Most clinicians that I work around and trainees are using multiple of these tools without any pre-training, without any, how do I become an astute consumer of it? Versus Epic, right, required me to sit there for 10 hours in a hotel room and then prove I could use it well before I could go back on service. The pendulum swung a little bit too much in one direction. We have to find some intermediary steps here.
Yeah. Okay, well, you mentioned Atul Gawande, and I just want to note or make sure we're cognizant that we are in Boston. We are surrounded by the best and brightest in medicine, and you are each very much on the vanguard of this kind of transformation in medicine, and it's a kind of usually medicine is not on the cutting edge of technological adoption. It's usually the lagging industry because safety and all these other issues. But for some reason, well, for money reasons and opportunity reasons, I guess, there's a lot of enthusiasm for bringing AI to medicine, almost first, lawyers too. So what I'm curious about is, and Rebecca, I'm going to put this to you first because you do work globally. What happens in the rest of the world? What happens in Alaska? What happens when you're not in Boston, Massachusetts? Is the rest of the industry going to, or the rest of medicine, clinical medicine, going to be able to keep pace, or is this going to be more of a gap?
It's a great question. I mean, first, 700 million people every week are already using ChatGPT. So this is like already in people's hands and in their daily lives and how they're determining how to do it. The question is kind of what are the deployment gaps to make this improve the quality of care you're delivering and patient outcomes. And some of that's contextual, some of that's having the models be trained on not only English-speaking data sets, not only on US guidelines, but all guidelines across the world. So there's a company, for example, Pathways, that was using all of the global guidelines. They got bought by Doximity. and now it's a US product. So we have to put enough resources out there in circulation that these become global products serving global clinicians. The second, I think, is there needs to be some pre-training for the astute clinician, as I mentioned before. And then in many ways, I think these are not billing products, unlike Epic. So we think of the front end of this, how do we make this continuous predictive tools to help you care for the patients in between these 5,000 hours in between encounters?
And are doctors ready for this, do you feel?
Oh, I mean, in our network, we fill up every slot of every demo within minutes. So later this week, we'll have 3,000 providers. They had, within 3 minutes, they filled up every demo slot. So there's very few clinicians who aren't interested in testing and vibe coding to see the difference. They need some governance structure. They need some help with how to deploy, how to train. But yes, there's high interest, low confidence. And I think the whole point of this panel, when I think about integrity, is it's really a practice of how to be consistent and reliable as a clinician. And then what can we provide in some of not only the academic frameworks, but some of the scaffolding for pre-training and continuous monitoring.
Okay. And Marc, are you seeing the same enthusiasm?
I think in Boston, you're always on, people are here, usually they want to be here because they want to, be at the best institutions, the top institutions. So they're usually really adept at adapting new tools. I think to your question, so I am seeing the same enthusiasm, at least in my little, bubble. I think the prior question about, Alaska and other places and AI tools, I do think we're going to grapple with a disparity, probably in the opposite direction, where the folks in rural or the folks with less access will be seeing the AI doctor or the AI triage.
Right.
And the folks in privileged areas, like here, might be seeing real doctors, world specialists, and that's going to become a resource that's going to become less and less as we go on. So I think we're going to grapple with that as a society and cross that bridge when we come to it, I think.
Okay. This is an Atlantic event, and Atlantic is a place of big ideas. So I need to ask each of you, what is the big takeaway? If you want to leave this room with kind of one sense of where we are and what to look out for, or what to note about AI entering clinical care, what is that message?
My aspiration is that this becomes a clinical nervous system. So when we think about the stressed patient at 2 in the morning, the hardware-enabled individual who may see, gosh, I'm seeing a new trend line I need to understand. I'm going to go to, my doctor said, go to this form of AI. Then they can interface with me maybe virtually in some way. I think we need to build some of that interconnectivity between visits. And then we're going to see a lot of decrease in stress and anxiety and building that trust in these interval time periods. If this becomes as scattered and decentralized as it is today, I think we're going to have increasing disparities, increasing equity, and just the stress and trust ratio will not have improved over time.
That's awesome. Marc?
I would just say, like the personal computer, Steve Jobs, I love this quote, but he always said it was a bicycle for the mind. It basically accelerated the capabilities of a human, and I think AI is going to do that for doctors. I think medicine is also a can't make mistakes field, and I think there'll never be a scenario where there won't be a doctor overlooking your test just because would you want to be on a plane that could take off and land using AI? We know it can. I'm still going for 2 pilots, so just my personal opinion.
So human in the loop, doctor in the loop. All right. Thank you both. This was fantastic. Appreciate it.
Eli Lilly and Company presents Unleashing the Power of AI in Clinical Research. Please welcome Amy Davis, Vice President for Clinical Trial Foundations at Eli Lilly and Company, Lora Todd, Vice President of Emerging Tech and AI at Eli Lilly and Company, and the Atlantic publisher, Alice McCown.
All right. Amy, Lora, thank you so much for joining us today. Thrilled to have this conversation with you. We're going to get started. So, Amy, I'm going to start with you first. We're today here in a huge science and technology hub, long known for its medical research groundbreaking. One of the most innovative trends in clinical research is happening in local communities. I want you to tell us a little bit about what you're doing there.
Yeah, thank you. So Lilly has really been, I think, on the forefront of utilizing what we call community-based research for several years. And this is really an opportunity for us to meet patients where they are, to meet patients where they live, where they work, where they play. And this is really about giving more access to people that may not have been able to participate in research in the past because they didn't live maybe next to a major medical center, right? And they couldn't take the time away from work or away from their families to participate in research. I think the other thing that's really important about community-based research is it enhances representation because it reaches populations that ultimately may be the people that are going to be using that medication when it is approved. And so that's really important. And it also offers research as a true healthcare option early in a patient's journey, much earlier than they may have gotten previously. And so again, it's not just the right thing to do, but it's good science.
Great. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the technology and tools that have advanced community-based trials in the last few years.
Yeah, obviously, Lilly had been doing work to do things for community-based research several years before COVID, and I think COVID was really something that for the industry really made us all think very differently about how we conducted research. And so, we were doing things prior with like e-consent and beginning to use e-source tools and things like that. But, I think telemedicine is another thing that really was unlocked through COVID. And I think things that we've continued to build in our trials now as part of our routine way of doing work. And I think, obviously we can't have a conversation about technology without talking about AI, right? And Lilly has really looked at every aspect of every piece of clinical research and how can we leverage AI and automation and other technology to really make it easier for patients and for investigators and their staff to conduct research. I think a couple of examples where we're using AI, and again, this is just a couple of the examples, but I think when you think about patient recruitment, you're able to leverage AI to go across multiple databases to identify the right patients for the right trials, and then you're able to find the right place for them to get access to that research. And I think it's kind of like a perfect marriage, right? And I think this is really powerful because patients now have a line of sight and companies are able to help and investigators are able to have a much broader line of sight of potential matches for their patients than they ever did in the past. And so if you think about clinical research, the longest pole in the tent in clinical research is enrollment, right? And so whatever you can do to speed enrollment, you're speeding the ability to potentially have a life-saving medication that has access for patients sooner. I think the other thing we're trying to do for reducing burden for patients and staff is looking at how we leverage AI and automation to integrate data, right? And so, nobody got into healthcare, I always say, to do paperwork. You got into healthcare to treat patients. I'm a pharmacist by training, right? And the thing I hated the most was having to be on the computer and do billing and things like that, or to re-enter data. With some of the technology we have today, we're finding that we can automate that so investigator sites can see and their staff can see more patients and bring more patients into clinical trials because they're not having to repeat routine things that they would have to do before AI exists. So those are just two examples, but we're certainly looking and being thoughtful, obviously, about how we're using AI.
Great. All right, Laura, I'm going to switch to you. You're driving the use of AI and other technology to improve trials at Lilly. What do you see as some of the most promising applications?
Oh, there's lots of great applications. So I would say one area that we're really leaning into, if you think about regulatory submissions, there are lots of opportunities in that space to make ourselves more efficient and more effective. And honestly, when we think about where we're going to invest, we're thinking about that because there's so much manual effort. Amy talked about paperwork. We have it at sites. We have it at pharma everywhere. And so when we can take out that manual effort and allow people to focus their time on higher level thinking, it's more motivating and it's a better use of their time. So in regulatory submissions, one thing you have to do are called patient narratives. And you generate content from the patient's results, things like adverse events, demographics, things like that. And so people were manually gathering the data, writing that up, getting them reviewed and approved and sent in. Well, with AI, we can create 80% of that content so people can then focus on review, adjustment, and get them approved. And we found that is equal to like 30 FTEs of effort, which is huge because those individuals now can work on higher level scientific thinking and advancing our molecules. So we love that. Another example kind of marries up with something Amy talked about. We're looking at trial design, gathering lots of sources we create, externally available sources, and it helps us design trials in a patient site-facing way. So we can understand based on procedures, like what is it going to cost? How much time will it take? What's the site burden? What's the patient burden? Because at the end of the day, if you create a trial that is perfect scientifically and takes too much time or effort, it's hard to keep people engaged. Like Amy said, recruitment and keeping those patients is super important. So with these tools, we iteratively design and adjust our designs to make them as optimized as possible so we can bring the right medicines to patients.
Great. We all hear about the downsides of AI. I want to hear a little bit about how you guys are navigating that in an industry where data integrity, patient privacy is absolutely critical.
Oh, for sure. So obviously we don't want machines to take over the world. Like, that's always the big fear, right? That's going to happen. So the reality is that, you spend the time to make sure you understand the problem you're solving. You do the right level of validation and testing on the solutions that you create. And we have rigor to do that. And it's not that it's easy, but we understand how to do that. Honestly, there's really two other challenges we're leaning in. It's really around adoption, whether it's for the people at Lilly that are using the AI or with the sites that have to then engage. You have to help them understand the why. Like, what is it going to do? How does it work? A lot of people initially said, oh, we can't do this. The regulators won't allow it. And that's just actually not accurate. You have to do it with the right controls. You have to do human in the loop. You have to oversee it. But like any good change, adoption and change management is critical, and you have to work through that with individuals. So that's one. And then, the other thing that you have to do is just continue to talk about, like, how is the technology changing? Like, how are you going to get the advances? And every time something changes, the models that we all use are improving at a pace that I didn't think I would see at this point in my career. It's super exciting. At the same time, you got to take time to pause, review, and then confirm that what it's doing is meeting the outcome that you expected. So I think the pace of technology change is the other thing, and it's exciting, but you have to have a plan, and we're working very closely together to do that.
Do you see a limit to what can be achieved?
I think we are in a super exciting time. Like I said, I didn't think I would see the pace of change as across my career. Like, it's gotten faster and faster, which is exciting. I think that it's kind of endless. I think we're going to look back on this time frame and say this was a huge tipping point of how we all can lean in together to leverage AI, to leverage the right tech, to make research more available and effective for everyone involved.
All right, we're out of time. I'm going to ask you one more question, Amy, because I'm thinking about recruitment. What other clinical trial challenges are you working to solve?
Yeah, I think the other challenges are really on the kind of regulatory policy front. If you look at the U.S. regulations, they're outdated. They don't match, even the regulations don't match the most current or the final guidance on decentralized clinical trial conduct. I think there needs to be more information provided to investigators about the burden of oversight, of like what is expected for oversight of local providers and vendors. More clarity on that. I think more clarity related to the use of digital health technologies. What is needed for, like, what is the burden of proof, and how does that pull through submission? And then last, I think about the impact on patients from a financial perspective. There are laws that prohibit patients from certain reimbursement, and certainly we need to have safe harbors for patients that can participate in research that they could benefit from, but also be reimbursed for their time and effort. And so I think there need to be things there that need to change within U.S. regulations and obviously also global regulations that we're also trying to shape and modernize.
Amazing. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Amy, Lora.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now for the democratization of discovery. AI is an equalizer in clinical trials. Please welcome Behtash Bahador, Senior Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships at CISCRP. Ellie Van Allen, Chief Division of Population Sciences and Chandra Nohria, Family Chair for AI Cancer Research at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and Willianne DeCromier-Plosky, Program Director at MRCT Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, with Atlantic Live contributor Thomas Getz.
All right. Well, as you just heard, clinical trials are an important and powerful opportunity for AI innovation. Clinical trials, I always thought of them as like the highest point of medical science. They're the gold standard of research. They are kind of where we get as close as we can to a ground truth. And then you kind of learn about what happens in clinical trials, and they are not so pure and beautiful in practice all the time, right? They can be messy, they can be sloppy, the people disappear, they are incredibly expensive, they're incredibly inefficient, and AI is going to fix all that. Or at least help. And so I think we have three people who are incredibly sophisticated in the science and art of clinical trials. So this is going to be a great conversation. So I looked at clinicaltrials.gov. There are nearly 600,000 clinical trials listed there, almost 100,000 clinical trials that are either recruiting or about to recruit. So there is just a massive surge of this kind of fairly messy scientific process going on. No wonder there's a lot of excitement about AI. I guess what I'm curious is when they talk about technology coming to a process, a discipline, usually goes faster, cheaper, better. We'll get to the faster and cheaper, but I want to start asking the three of you, what is better? Like, what can AI do to clinical trials that makes it better? And Behtash, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, I appreciate it. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you folks for having me here. So I'm with a nonprofit called CISCRP. The full name is the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, so you can just call us CISCRP. And we work in patient engagement in clinical research. One key part of that is understanding the perceptions and experiences that patients, the public, as well as participants have in clinical research. And another part of that is helping to simplify the documents that go to patients, from informed consent through to results communication. And so the results communication, the end, is where I'll start directly with your question. We've looked at how AI and large language models can be used to develop the first draft of some of those clinical study results, the aggregate overall results of a study. This is an area that there's a requirement in the EU for every trial that takes place to have one of these result summaries, and now the NIH is coming out and looking at making this a requirement for any studies that they fund. So, you know, it's an important tool that could help achieve some efficiency, but everything that we have learned from patients and the public, as well as actually trying to use this tool, is that it's critically important to just be used as a tool up front, and then the rest of the human-centered process moves forward.
Okay, Ellie, what do you see in terms of it? Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think I'd come at this from a slightly different perspective. So I'm a computer nerd who accidentally became an oncologist, and have sort of seen all of the patient experiences as a provider through this lens. And so in that context, we just see so many kinds of inefficiencies from our end on how we do the first step. How do we find the right patient for the right trial? And so what we're doing at Dana-Farber is launching something called MatchMiner, which is an AI tool that helps to do two things. It matches patients to the right trial based off of combination of their genomics. So what's the tumor DNA? How does it explain what's going on with their cancer, and whether there are drugs that actually make sense to be tested in a trial setting for that patient. And then conversely, from the researcher side, it asks the question of, well, amongst this sea of tens of thousands of patients, are there patients that are eligible for my trial? And these are tasks that have historically been very hard to do, that have led to lots of inefficiencies, and we think are the kinds of spaces where we can use AI directly to impact that first step of matching patients to trials at the right, in the right way at the right time.
Okay, and Willianne, what do you see?
Hi, so thank you. My name is Willianne, and I am at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's and Harvard. And basically, we're a small center that works across the entire clinical research enterprise to try and understand what are key questions emerging in clinical research and to develop tools to address these issues, one of which is a recent toolkit on AI in clinical research. And I'm just going to speak to my role in particular, which I lead our representation and research portfolio. So some of what we do ties in directly to what Behtash and Ellie have just said. Really, I think one of the key aspects around AI is to reach a broader audience across, whether it's in the United States or globally, to include more representative participants in clinical trials. That could be whether it's translation, able to quickly translate when you're interfacing with patients during the informed consent process or plain language documents. It could be helping to reach participants that have disabilities to have facilitated access where they don't have to directly go into the site. So there's many potential possibilities for how this could be of great service on top of the operational efficiency and other things that we're looking for.
So I think that's incredibly promising. It does kind of, in many ways, clinical trials, as I understand it, traditionally have been very much about homogeneity, right? They want to neutralize as much differences as possible so that the experiment can kind of run its course. So what you're talking about is introducing more heterogeneity, which gets more complicated, right? So like, is the AI up to that job? Is the AI, I guess I'd ask all of you this, but I'll start with Willianne. Is AI up to the job that we want it to be in terms of making things even more, in some sense, more complicated?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to if the AI is up to the job. I would say that the heterogeneity is incredibly important in clinical trials for many reasons. To be able to have a product that is taken by people of many different kinds of backgrounds, you want to make sure that that product has been tested in people with those backgrounds. So for example, we often have never included people who are pregnant in clinical trials. Yeah. And then when you become pregnant, you have no idea what you're allowed to take. You're just having this conversation with your doctor, and your doctor says, like I have severe asthma, and my doctor said to me, well, we know you need to breathe, so take the medication, but we haven't tested this. So really having this kind of representation across your trials is really important. And I think that, as Ellie said, helping to match your patients, what your kind of the condition profile is, to the potential participants that could participate in that trial that aren't necessarily in your immediate area of the location of the clinical trial site is probably one of the most effective ways.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, I would say that the AI itself technically is more than up to the job. At least I think so, and I think a lot of the folks from the pure technical geek side would sort of argue the same. The bigger question, I think, is whether all the other pieces of the healthcare system, depending on where one is technically up to the job of meeting the technical requirements of the AI. So does hospital X out in place Y have the infrastructure to facilitate the integration and deployment of that kind of a technology in their possibly dated information technology systems or other kinds of things, and what kinds of issues will arise if we don't make sure that that's the case. So if we train an AI to do these tasks, but they're only in certain hospital environments that treat certain kinds of patients, not only will that be excluding the initial sort of wave of patients who might benefit from this experience, we're then going to start to train AI that itself can't generalize to those sites. And so in some sense, it's almost like the AI tech itself isn't the challenge, it's the entire ecosystem around it, and whether as a community we're able to invest in that. In our world, we have the Dana-Farber main site, and we have regional campuses, and actually it's been one of the most mission critical parts of our plans and visions for what we're doing in the AI space, is to ensure that those regional campuses have the same technological capabilities to do the same kinds of AI trial matching and other kinds of activities that you can do down the road from here.
Okay. And so just staying on this idea of the kind of the patient side, because in a clinical trial there are lots of patients. Behtash, your organization recently did this amazing survey that kind of got at what is the patient concern around AI. And I just thought I'd ask you to kind of give us some of your high points of that result, because it was somewhat counterintuitive.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and there was actually 2 surveys that we've done. One was in 2024, smaller sample size, about 1,000 people, US and Europe, including some folks who have been trial participants. And for that one, we were focusing on the development of clinical research documents.
Right.
And folks generally reported that they do have familiarity with AI. And the more familiarity that individuals had with AI, the more that they trusted AI to sort of act on its own to develop clinical research documents. So lower levels of human involvement. And another subgroup, really interestingly, that also had that similar sentiment was people who have been in clinical research. So my own personal take on that is I think individuals who have built a relationship and have trust with a site and going through the process of being in research essentially say, I trust you, so if you trust the AI to do this, then sure, sounds good. But in general, within that survey, folks did have more trust when there was more human involvement in the development. So again, sure, use AI as part of the process to develop documents. Now, we did a much larger survey last year as part of our biannual survey that we've been doing for a decade, but the first time that we've asked about AI. This has 12,000 individuals who responded and 4,000 clinical trial participants. And again, a lot of folks mentioning that they have familiarity with AI, but for this one, we focused on comfortability with AI collecting, analyzing, reporting on clinical data. And for that, there was, again, comfortability with the use of AI to process that kind of information, the high-level clinical trial data that's collected during the process of the research. But the lower level of comfort was actually with personal health reports as well as imagery. There was plenty of comfort with sort of some of the biometric stuff. So, again, my take on it is you want to use AI to process the data that you get from this device on my wrist? Sure, go for it. That was about 75% of the people comfortable with that. But it was 50-50 when it comes to you're looking at a scan of my body using AI. I don't know.
Yeah, Willianne, you've worked a lot on patient trust in the clinical trial process. Let me just see what your reaction is to that.
Well, I think that one of the challenges around there's a lot to unpack here. I think there's some really great points. That one of the questions we were discussing in the prep session was I talked about representation and research and the ability of AI to be able to find patients and match patients, which is a wonderful thing, but it's also challenging because the greater ability you have to find people, you have the ability to be found. And there's challenges with that because there's lots of vulnerable communities out there that, are kind of in the crosshairs sometimes. And so now that we're integrating data records across many systems, you have AI able to integrate information not only across medical records, but across your social media and other kinds of records. So, you can find people, they can be found. So that's challenging. At the same time, I think Behtash brought up a great point around community engagement, how critical that is in the clinical trial process. We've worked for years, 20, 30 years, trying to really integrate community engagement, sustained community engagement in clinical trials to drive trials that are responsive to communities. But now with AI, it has the potential to replace those community voices. AI can imitate almost anything. It can imitate, it's being programmed to imitate people, from the South, from Brooklyn, from, whatever. And so the danger there is that it would be potentially less expensive or less time consuming to just use some kind of AI to stand in for the very valuable in-person and in-depth patient engagement that you need to actually develop clinical trials that are responsive to the needs of the community.
Totally. Ellie, please.
Yeah, I can chime in on that as well, because actually just to piggyback off of that point, even more dramatically so, what we've also observed, and it's just required certain kinds of interventions that sort of lead towards a more high-tech, high-touch kind of feel, is that if you get the patient on the trial, in a lot of community settings and other places that perhaps are further away from sort of an epicenter like some of the quaternary care places, we needed to institute patient navigators to follow the patients over time, because they don't need to just come the first time for the initial trial visit or whatnot. They need to keep coming, and in some cases these trials are very difficult to actually stick to. And having a patient navigator system with trusted individuals who are part of the community, who can speak in a way that sort of resonates with the patients was mission critical. And it's hard to imagine AI itself, positively changing that. And then the risk is actually that there'll be declines in participation if we don't consider that the high touch part along with the high tech.
Right. So, because this is important, because a lot of people talk about retention and engagement as huge opportunities for AI, because a kind of agent can engage with the patients and keep them on track with the trial. But I think what you're suggesting is that can also have some unintended consequences. And I would love to have you guys explain or touch on what those unintended consequences might be. Behtash, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. I think, like anything else, there is no magic bullet, or silver bullet, and there's no magic wand. There's no one size fits all solution here. And again, from our long time work in patient engagement and working together with patients, understanding their perceptions and their needs, just as Willie-Ann said, folks really, really value that in-person communication. So whether it's a navigator or primarily what we see in our surveys is, and what we hear from patients, is that they really want to talk with their doctor, their own doctor, which I guess is becoming increasingly difficult to do these days on both sides. So I do think that there are a lot of folks that are going to be utilizing AI. They're using it as a way to access information, translate that information into terms that they can better understand, and at the same time, maybe some of those individuals, but other equal amount of other individuals are not going to do that, and they're still going to need that face-to-face, high-touch, as you said, approach.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, which I completely agree, I think an additional risk is just going to be, frankly, a further erosion of trust in the system from the patient perspective. If some of these bad outcomes that could result from this just furthers an already ongoing process that's been happening over the last 5 years or so about trust in the medical system writ large from the patient's perspective. And so if we don't deliver AI in a way that is considerate of all of these factors, I think it's just going to make all of those issues worse.
All right, Willie-Ann.
Well, I was just going to say, and I'm probably stealing a little bit of your thunder because we talked about this before, but when we talked about communication, one of the great things in AI lately has been these AI scribes that allow doctors. My husband is a head and neck cancer doctor who gets very little time, with each patient. And it has enabled him to have face-to-face conversations again with his patients while the scribes take the notes. And you've talked about this, which is wonderful. But then trust at the same time, if it's not also having, so that's also where you have a provider interacting with you. So one of my worries is that as especially rural health systems are being collapsing in some ways, I guess I would say. And then there's an initiative to say, oh, well, we'll just replace the providers with AI. People will have access to AI instead of a care provider. If that modality, that AI or that instrument that you're interacting with is not accessible to you, if it's not built well to communicate with you well, if it's not accessible for you as a person with a disability, and many of us have, if I can't see it visually or you can't, access this tech, if you're an older person, if the help desk to use that is not accessible, then you're going to be very frustrated, and you may misdiagnose yourself. There's, lots of people using these now to even in pregnancy to monitor, their fetal heartbeats at home. If you're not using that properly and misdiagnosing yourself and then not able to reach your provider, the expectation now is your provider will be available 24/7 to answer these questions that the bot is, bringing up. how, you might get quite frustrated with the
Yeah.
system, and then retention is going to be a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so yesterday, I'm sorry to bring up regulation, but yesterday, the FDA said that it was going to start a pilot for better AI-driven clinical trials, or to test whether AI-driven clinical trials are better, and really working on this faster element of bringing data back to review much faster than traditionally. So I'm curious where, not necessarily specific to that move, but clearly there's things going on even at the FDA with trying to take advantage of AI for clinical trials. So what I'm curious about is, like, where do you see regulation needing to kind of pay attention with this kind of AI-centric clinical trial process? Where does a regulator really need to mind what's going on because something's changed? Ellie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in some sense, globally, we've been seeking some guidance and some collaborative guidance from regulatory bodies to help us define what the actual rules should be, or are even, because absent that, then it becomes rather chaotic. And I think it's fantastic that there's interest in doing formal tests of AI for things like efficiency, streamlining. And we've observed, sort of almost like one step away from that, some of the elements of trying to streamline IRB reviews, all these things that involve like heavy amounts of documentation and parsing through massive piles of things that people don't want to do. It take lots of time. This is where this is potentially transformative. The risks, though, are almost similar to what I think we've talked about earlier with respect to issues around hallucination, generalizability, bias, those kinds of things. And that's why we need our regulators to help us construct and fund proper clinical studies of these kinds of approaches. And so this is an example where it's happening. It sounds like it's sort of happening gently so far, and I think and gently and collaboratively, and that I think is the right way to go about it. But there's still a lot of territory to explore.
And Willianne, do you have a sense on where regulators should keep their eyes open?
Some sense. I mean, I wish my colleague Trevor's in the audience, who developed our AI toolkit, and it's very comprehensive in this space. But I would just say, from the representation space, there's been a lot of discussion around this, that you need to make sure that you're training the AI on, very representative samples, like what's out there. I would also just say, in my experience prior to working at the MRCT Center, I spent 20 years in global health, and the last job in that was in doing modeling of disease systems and kind of healthcare systems so that countries could use these models. And in HIV, it was very interesting because you have to put in all of the data from trials and from efficacy studies. And the most recent efficacy studies would show very small effect sizes because they're comparing to a standard of care, which is very high. And so it's just a small tweak, and so it shows a small effect size. Whereas the older trials in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic showed massive effect sizes because you're comparing to nothing. But what would happen is we'd see these meta-analyses, and they would just take these statistics and average them. And without really understanding what the problems were, with these, and, that there was loss to follow-up in the trials. And I think that is really a concern now, that if AI is going to be used to sort of scan the literature to develop, standards or any kind of comparison, that it's just going to be taking numbers, without context. And that is what I think is really going to be an issue for regulators to think about. Like, how are we involving humans who have in-depth knowledge in these topics in this process of evaluating?
Right. Well, that's fantastic. Behtash, did you have the last moment?
Yeah, I think it's really important as well to consider, of course, I'm going to take the participant and patient-facing perspective on this, is being transparent about how AI is being used, right? And I mean, the last thing we want to do is add a lot more information to a consent form, but certainly there needs to be general education for patients and the public on the fact that AI is being used in clinical trials and how, and hopefully that allows us to establish a baseline of understanding that then we don't need to go into for a prospective participant who's going through the consent process. But that's something that both of those surveys that I mentioned were very, very clear on. Use it, but tell us that you're using it.
Yeah. Well, listen, this was fantastic. Clearly, lots of promise, lots to work out as well. But thank you all for sharing your wisdom with us. Thanks all.